Tonight, I am going to be talking about the 16th chapter of How to Do Life by Kalag Rinpoche. And this chapter is titled The Relationship Between Destructive Emotions and Our Thoughts. And I think this will be an interesting chapter, needless to say. It begins with describing destructive emotions as usually being talked about as negative emotions in English or conflicting emotions. The Sanskrit word is kleshas, and klesha means poison, and it is referring specifically to poison of the mind. There are negative emotions and there are positive emotions. And this chapter is primarily talking about the negative emotions, or what are referred to as kleshas or poisons of the mind. You might say these are the usual suspects: arrogance, pride, jealousy, desire, aggression, indifference, or denial, and so forth. The chapter gives a general outline of the Buddhist view of these negative emotions or kleshas. These destructive emotions relate to the negative states of mind that are closely related. And on the other hand, by understanding these, we can incorporate our understanding and our awareness of what's going on in our mind to our spiritual interests and our spiritual goals, and also include our psychological well-being, ethics, and morality, that all of this is involved in these destructive emotions. By understanding them better, we can avoid the negativity that they bring about, the suffering that they bring about into our lives. Kalag Rinpoche talks about the ultimate goal of Buddhism, which is the state of Buddhahood, a state of ultimate perfection, which is beyond suffering. So this is the direction we all want to go in the long term, because it doesn't happen overnight. But then there are temporary goals, and this is reducing the suffering in our lives and reducing the suffering in the lives of others. He references that nobody wants to suffer, and that excessive suffering can overwhelm a person and make their life meaningless, and that it's good for us to understand the difference between suffering that we have control over and suffering that we don't have control over. And he does mention that much of the suffering that we human beings experience is self-created, but that doesn't make the suffering less intense. In fact, if you tell a person the reason why you're suffering is because of your own actions, they might get mad at you. They're thinking that you are blaming them for their pain. And this would be it wouldn't be an indication of how confused they are, but we have to be careful what we say. But if we can understand our own suffering in this way, it can really help. It can help our suffering become less intense, and it can bring meaning into our lives with this understanding. On the other hand, if a person's suffering is too intense, they don't have energy to address what is important, that the suffering becomes overwhelming. Quote, intense suffering is a form of madness. We are not quite with it. The torment is too great. I find that an interesting quote, that intense suffering is a form of madness. I have found, just from personal experience, that people that are experiencing intense suffering frequently lash out at people around them. For instance, I have been spending a lot of time in medical clinics the last few months, and I've heard a number of stories from nurses and other technicians. One nurse said every day people are swearing at her, calling her all kinds of bad names. one patient hit her and charges were filed, and he ended up spending jail time. And it's because these people are in intense suffering. I also feel, this is my own personal opinion, that right now, at least in the United States, it seems like it's okay to blame all of your suffering on other people and to be a victim and not have to be responsible for how you act in public. We need to be aware of this and have respect for other people, even if we are having a lot of suffering in our lives. If we do have this overwhelming suffering, it consumes us, it saps our energy, it takes up so much of us that we don't have time to really work with our lives in terms of our spiritual life. For even us who have practiced over the years, that we go through ups and downs, that we have times of greater suffering and times of less suffering. And when there is less suffering, there might even be times of happiness. But even with this underlying happiness that can surface, it does not necessarily lead to a sense of lasting happiness. It can lead to, when it's gone, more dissatisfaction. That the nature of samsara is for human beings is poverty mentality of never having enough. And even if you get what you want, you're not going to be happy for long because things change and the happiness is gone. You buy a new car and you might be happy for a month or two or three, but then it starts showing age. It needs to be washed. New cars come out and your car suddenly doesn't look so nice as it did when it was the newest model, and on and on and on. So, with meditation and other practices in Buddhism, we can develop new ways of working with suffering and its causes. Kralik Rinpoche then goes on to mention that there are suffering we have some control over, that we can do something about it. And on the other hand, most of the suffering that we experience, we really don't have control over the actual circumstances. That the world we live in is unpredictable. It operates in a manner that is, quote, completely independent of our choices, desires, and aspirations. And I think that really does sum up my experience. So, what is left for us to work with is our emotional life, our emotional responses to what we really don't have control over. He says that our emotional life is about our well being or ill being, that we have a choice. Are we going to go into the direction of emotional well being, or are we going to buy into these negative emotions and go down the path of just ill being, creating more unhappiness and suffering? He then mentions that our thoughts can be very biased, they can be very distorted, that there is a common misconception that somehow or another logic is the way to get to truth and that the emotions lead the other way around. On the other hand, thoughts can be very distorted and biased, and frequently are. If thoughts and logic led to the same place, we wouldn't have such divisions in this country about politics. So even thoughts are considered obscurations of the mind. Emotions are considered obscurations of the mind. So are thoughts. And thoughts are slightly different than emotions, but they're very, very closely related. I think I mentioned this already. Emotions are always considered negative or destructive, these kleshas, and they are closely related to distorted thoughts. Together, they create, quote, the deluded states of ordinary sentient creatures, end quote. Another way to put that, they create the six realms that sentient beings can reside in. And that these different Diluted states arise from a sense of self, of I, me. And he says part of this feeling is innate, that we're born with it. You're standing on the edge of a cliff and you have this urge to step back. You hear a very loud noise, and you kind of tense up. These very almost primal reactions. The other is the source of most of this identity of I, me, this is who I am, is acquired throughout our life. He uses the term the fabricated self. Yalwan Karmapa has used the term fabricated self. I think it's a very good description of this self. He doesn't talk about it in this chapter, but fabricate can mean to put together from parts, like fabricating, say, a car in a assembly factory. And this is what we do with this idea of who we are. We're given a name by our parents, and we gradually learn to associate ourselves with that name. We don't choose the name. Maybe later on you can change your name and go to a name you like to have, but originally we're given the name. And then we take on things that other people tell us, things from our culture. We start as we grow up throughout childhood, start liking certain things and disliking other things. And gradually we develop this self-identity, and we use negative emotions to express this self-identity. One of my favorite stories about self-identity happened at a wedding, and you had the bride and the groom were followed behind as they walked up to the altar by a little girl and a little boy, probably about 3 to 4 years old, I'm going to say, maybe even 5. Everything went fine during the wedding, and then afterwards there was a banquet and an open mic at the end of the banquet, and friends of the bride and groom would go up there and tell stories about their experience with the bride or the groom. And eventually this little boy went up there and he just said this: I'm cute. I know I'm cute, and I want to thank all of you for telling me that I'm cute. And then he put the microphone down and sat down. This is how we develop a self-identity. Now, when he gets to be 30, I have a feeling that that's not going to cut things. He's not going to be able to say, I am cute, and the rest of you respect me because I am cute. At some point, that just doesn't work. But this is how we develop ideas about ourselves. And again, a lot of it comes from culture. There are roles that we take on. We bring in all kinds of things, and then we say, this is who we are. And much of this happens at a subconscious level. We're not even aware that this is who we think we are. This sense of I, this fabricated self, is insecure because things are constantly changing, circumstances are constantly changing. This fabricate is somewhat of an illusion. Another use of the word fabricate is to fabricate evidence in a trial, which means you're just making things up. And there is this element of the fabricated self too, that we deep down know that we're making this up and it's not solid, it's not real. And there is this sense of insecurity and fear and what's called a poverty mentality. When we develop this fabricated self, then there's also other, which is not self. Then we become jealous of other, we become mad at other, we become desirous of other, and on and on and on and on and on. So these destructive emotions are related to perceived threats, fear, and then we have actions of body, speech, and mind. And then as a result of our actions, we suffer. We think that we are fixed, solid beings, and we're not. And we think others are also fixed and solid and unchanging, and they're not either. We're constantly in a state of fluidity. This fabricated self wants solidity. Interestingly enough, with fluidity, there is a continuity that runs through our lives and our experiences and our mental processes and so forth. That things don't happen randomly. Things come into being because of causes and conditions. With mindfulness and awareness, we can see all of this more clearly. We're less likely to get caught up in our expectations and our judgments. There's a phrase in English called going with the flow. And in a way, that's what this is talking about, is being aware of the flow of what's happening in any situation. And instead of trying to establish solidity, like taking a picture of a waterfall, you have the waterfall and you don't need the picture. But a picture of a waterfall is much more predictable because it's not moving, it's not going anywhere. To go on, he brings in the point of leisure, that leisure is very important, that in samsara, our kleshas propel us. Quote, we are constantly caught up in this cycle of self abuse and self destructive behavior. And there is no leisure, there's no break, no time to work on changing, developing new ways of responding, new ways of being, and so forth. If we have leisure, we can take a break. We can look within, we can do self examination, and we can find that we're not solid and we're not inflexible. We start seeing possibilities. We start seeing that there is constant change. New is constantly happening. I showed some pictures of the landscape here before we started recording this, and we just have had snow, and it's amazing how snow have a dramatic change in the appearance of trees, meadows, and so forth. And even the difference between a cloudy day with snow and a sunny day with snow on the ground is very, very different. So if we can take some leisure time to investigate, to meditate, to practice, this enriches us. Quote, the poverty of the self lies in an unsatisfied hunger for consolidation and reaffirmation. So if we can take time off, take a break, meditate, practice, kind of soak in directly the experience of what we are having at the present time, we can kind of bypass this unsatisfied hunger. Leisure allows the self to become what it can become. And what comes to my mind at this point was when I would lead a meal and we would eat in silence. And I would do that sometimes during retreats. And I would take the singing bowl and put it on the table by me and instruct people when you hear the sound, quit eating and just listen to the sound. That would focus their mind. They're eating in silence to begin with. And then when you can't hear it anymore, go back to eating. And I would ring the singing bowl maybe 3 or 4 times. And afterwards, we'd have a discussion. And frequently, people would say the food tasted better or something like that. And I would respond after everybody had commented that wanted to comment that with mindfulness, life tastes better. If we can take time off and meditate and be more mindful as we go through our daily lives, we find that our lives are enriched, that there is more satisfaction and joy in going through life, even if the circumstances haven't changed at all. So understanding ourselves better leads to having a more meaningful life, and leisure gives us the time to understand ourselves. And it's a matter of degree. It's not an all or nothing situation. That's an important point. Now he goes into popular theories as well as religious theories about a self or a soul. And he says there are a lot of explanations, theories, ideas, and so forth about this. In popular culture and in religion and philosophy, there are more. You've got a self, you've got a higher self, you've got a soul. Sometimes nowadays people talk about having a soul mate. Buddhism sees all of this as being off the mark. I remember a talk that Barter Tukla Rinpoche gave, and when it came to the question and answers, somebody asked, "Is there a soul in Buddhism?" And Lama Yeshe Gyamtso was translating, and so he translated that question into Tibetan. And then Barter Rinpoche asked Lama Yeshe Gyamtso a question in Tibetan. And then Lama Yeshe gave a very long answer. And then Barter Tukla Rinpoche asked another question in Tibetan. And they went back and forth about 5 minutes like this. Obviously, the translator was trying to explain to Barter Tukla Rinpoche what a soul meant in Western culture. And after talking back and forth about 5 minutes, Lama Yeshe Gyamtso faced the questioner and gave the answer. No. The translator. A very simple no. It's interesting the way Tralik Rinpoche presents this. He says, well, people have been talking about this for millennia, and there's no definitive answer about having a self or a soul. There are a lot of answers. When it comes to experience, if you look at your experience, you can't really describe it either. He says you can talk about it in the language of transcendence. I think that was the phrase he used. But there's no really good way to even describe one's experience of having this soul or this self and so forth. So what we as practitioners need to do is pay attention to our experience and not theorizing about it or embellishing it. He says very simply, we are experiencing what or who we are, and we are not what we are not experiencing. So to go back to leisure, it's important to not be rushed, to take time to work on your own mind and the way you mind experiences life, you might say. If our mind is less disturbed, or perhaps even not disturbed, we're in a much better place. With a mind that's running wild with speculation, strong emotions, and all sorts of other things going on, that there's no clarity and there's really no understanding. We become trapped in the same old, same old. It's easy to, you might say, change the channels and find a new partner, get a new job, move to a new city, get a new car, and suddenly it's more of the same old, same old. You change the channel, but it's the same soap opera. So leisure offers a way out. It offers a chance to have some clarity, a chance to see our negative emotions and work with them. And it is our negative emotions that are the cause of our unhappiness and suffering. Then he comes up with a phrase that I'd never heard of before: enlightened hedonism. And the point is, in Buddhism, happiness and being happy is even more important than goodness or ethical conduct. If we are happy, that goodness leads to happiness and satisfaction and contentment rather than the other way around. Quote, in Buddhism, the good life, the virtuous life is encouraged because it leads to a state of mind where we find satisfaction instead of being dissatisfied. So if we have a virtuous life and a clear mind, we will be satisfied. We will be content. We will be happy. We will have a good life. So this idea of hedonism is seeking after one's happiness, but it is, you might say, hedonism with the understanding of what the causes of happiness are rather than self-indulgence, which leads to more suffering and pain. So he uses the term self-satisfaction as being the key. If we have self-satisfaction, then we will have satisfaction and fulfillment. With self-satisfaction, the fabricated self is seen through, and its insecurities and illusions are seen through, and you realize there's nothing to prove. You realize that that is no big deal. In other places, Tralik Rinpoche talks about the functional self, but the functional self is fluid. It has nothing to prove. And to finish up this chapter, even when you get to that point, the kleshas may still be there. They may occasionally, you might say, suck you in, but they're much weaker. He says that you can distinguish between reasonable and unreasonable expressions of the kleshas, that you don't get, you might say, swept away mentally by when a klesha arises, that there's wisdom and skillful means present. And if you do indulge in them, it won't be as strong as you would have earlier in your life. And you'll have some regret and you will want to change. All of this leads to being less overpowered and consumed by our negative emotions. This leads to having fewer problems in life, being happier and having less unhappiness. At this point, he says we have a vision of who we want to become. The question is, what does Tralik Rinpoche mean by leisure? And the traditional meaning of leisure is having time to practice, that you have the ability to have free time. Now, I will add this, that in the 21st century, with our digital devices, our automobiles, we can instantly be distracted by 1,000 different things. We can get in the car and go to anywhere for entertainment. You can subscribe to 100 different channels on the TV. You can do streaming on the internet. That it gets more and more difficult to find leisure because there's so much entertainment out there. My opinion is that we really have to have discipline to make sure that we do set aside a little part of our daily lives for practice. Question is about enlightened hedonism. The questioner looked up on the internet the definition of hedonism, and it just seems to be absolutely the total opposite of what Tralik Rinpoche was referring to. And you're right, because traditionally hedonism means eat, drink, be merry, wine, women, sex, drug, sex, and rock and roll. Take your pick. But here, what he's talking about is that all beings want to be happy. They want happiness. And so this enlightened hedonism is realizing what the causes of happiness are and what the causes of suffering are, and avoiding the causes of suffering and encouraging the causes of happiness. And in doing so, you will behave virtuously, you will be satisfied, you will be content, happy, and you will be benefiting other people as well as yourself.